Welcome back to OFFbit. Today we'll be returning back to the Dell Precision T3500 from a previous episode. We'll be looking at cheap upgrades for this platform, with a CPU upgrade and RAM upgrades costing under $20 US, or in my local currency of $25 Australian. So stick around and just see what a slight bit of cash splashing can do to a system just like this.
A few weeks ago, looked at this Dell Precision T3500 we picked up for approximately $35 USD. This machine had an old graphics card and it is in need of a bit of a cooling overhaul. We proceeded in fixing the overheating problems, the ill graphics performance issues with a cheap, newer AMD RX550, and we also installed a cheap 120GB SSD SATA from Kingston. The Dell Precision only had 4GB of RAM at the time, but this was enough to scratch in to play Fortnite. Well, today that's going to change. After spending approximately $12 US at our local CX in Australia, we came with 12GB of DDR3 RAM, which is 6 sticks of 2GB DDR3 RAM sticks. This allows us to take advantage of the X58 triple channel memory layout. We cannot use the original memory sticks we had in this machine. This is because they are ECC modules. ECC modules do not mix well with non-ECC sticks. So out they came. Now we've installed our 12GB of RAM, we're ready to put it in our cheap Xeon that we picked up from eBay. The Xeon W3565 is a 3.2 GHz clocked Xeon, used solely on the LGA 1366 platform, running 8 meg of level 3 cage and sporting a TDP of 130 watts. This CPU supports 4 cores and 8 threads, but the RAM is only clocked at 1066 MHz. So unfortunately our 1333 MHz DDR3 RAM won't be running at its full potential. And there is no way to change those settings in the Dell BIOS, none that we know of anyway. But that's fine. We're working with a very cheap system and we're trying to do this on a tight budget. Once the system is put back together, our system is ready now to boot. With its 12GB of RAM and its more punchy Xeon W3565 running at 3.2 GHz base clock, opposed to our old Xeon, the W3520, running at 2.67 GHz. Getting over that 3 GHz mark, in our opinion, should help out a lot more in games. However, let's check out the benchmarks and just see how much performance we have gained. In 7-zip, our Xeon W3565 pushed out performing similar to the i7-950, which was paired with a much better and more capable motherboard. The single core score performance was pushing close to the 3rd Gen i5 performance, which is pretty good. We beat the original Xeon W3520 by 16.71% in the single core benchmarks and 15.33% in the multi-core score benchmarks. In CPU ID CPU-Z's benchmark, the Xeon W3565 pushed its single core performance close to 2nd Gen i5s. We beat the original Xeon W3520 by 18.7% in the single core benchmarks and 20.8% in the multi-core benchmarks. We also noticed that the W3565 beat the i7-950 in both single and multi-core benchmarks. Finally, in Cinebench, our W3565 Xeon scored 517 points, only being beaten by the i7-950 by a margin of 2 points. W3565 also beat the old W3520 by 75 points, but works out to be about 16.9% performance increase in performance over the W3520. Overall, this upgrade is showing about a 17.7% increase across all benchmarks over the W3520. Which is not a bad performance increase for a CPU that costs under $10. Our first game we played today was Fortnite. We did run this in both performance rendering mode with low settings and DirectX 11 mode. Fortnite played perfectly smooth for the most part, with only suffering a bit of load lag in performance rendering mode from time to time, mainly at the start of the game when we first started playing. Our frame rates for the W3565 for Fortnite in performance mode with an average frame rate of 118.5 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate hit 64.5 frames per second and our maximum frame rate hit 200.8 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 9.9 frames per second. When comparing to the W3520, the older CPU that we were running, we got a 27% increase in average frames, which was originally at 93.3 frames a second, and we went up to an average frame rate of 118.5 frames a second with the W3565. Our 0.1% lows were 6% quicker, with 9.3 frames per second on the W3520 in the 0.1% lows and 9.9 frames per second on the W3565. It is also worth noting that these benchmarks are subjective, since each game is different. We try to keep some consistencies by playing in the same area, but still, your mileage will vary depending on what happens in that particular round of the game. Running Fortnite in DirectX 11 rendering mode with low settings, which is the video what you're watching at the moment. We found that the Fortnite gameplay still ran quite fine. The game did run a little slower, but nothing that was unplayable. The game generally gave us close to 60 frames per second for most of our gameplay, with only having dips when loading new areas. This usually happens and was mainly suffered at the very beginning of the round when we're jumping out of the bus. Frame rates for Fortnite running in DirectX 11 rendering mode, our average frame rate was 56.3 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 27.9 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit 91.1 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 2.4 frames per second. As you can see here, the game did run a lot slower, but nothing that we could call unplayable, and not by a long shot either. However, if you're looking for the fast, smooth gameplay, we do recommend running this game on the performance render mode with this PC or a similar setup. Moving on to Sea of Thieves. We ran Sea of Thieves at 1920 by 1080 on cursed settings. Now in Sea of Thieves we did not experience a high frame rate, though in saying that the game was still very much fun and very much playable. The lower frame rate did not get too low that it was overall noticeable. We did experience some brief load lags when new islands were loading in. However, that is nothing unusual with Sea of Thieves. Our frame rates for Sea of Thieves. Average frame rate of 46.5 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 14.7 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit 60.4 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 5.5 frames per second. Now, if you haven't played this game before, this game can be a lot of fun with the right friends. We did find that this system did run the game quite fine. However, for better performance, it would probably be better looking at something a bit better in the video card department. In my opinion, something like an AMD RX550 or an NVIDIA GTX 1050 would probably be better married up with this PC. But if you're trying to keep to a strict budget, this AMD RX550 runs this game quite fine. And if you have a GT 1030 from NVIDIA, you should get a similar gaming experience, but you'll probably get a few more frame rates over the RX550. Next, we tried our hands at Dota 2. We ran Dota 2 at high settings with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. Now, here's a little disclaimer. I have no idea what I'm doing in this game, so please excuse my noobish gameplay here. Dota 2 really did not give us any problems with performance. The game ran perfectly fine, or good enough that the gameplay did not seem to affect the feel of the game from this system being an older system. Frame rates for Dota 2 are: we had an average frame rate of 65.7 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit 46.9 frames per second, and our maximum frame rates hit 73.9 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 41.9 frames per second, so no problem there from the system's CPU side. As the frame rate showed, this game ran perfectly fine on this system. I really don't think there is much worth doing upgrading wise to make this gameplay any better, unless you really are looking for that high frame rate gameplay experience. If this game really did give you any issues with this system, we really could just ramp the video settings back, and that would just make the game run a lot better. But our thoughts, it's not needed. Moving on, we gave GTA 5 a run. We ran GTA 5 in DirectX 10 mode with low settings and the graphics resolution of 1920 by 1080. In GTA 5 we did feel the frame rate did dip from time to time, but this was still very much playable. We never saw the game hit 60 frames per second when driving around town. The CPU here did not struggle at all in this game, showing us that if we really wanted better performance, the GPU is our weak point that we need to target. However, the RX550 still gave us quite playable gameplay in this game. Now, the frame rates for GTA 5 are: we got an average frame rate of 51.3 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hits 33.3 frames per second, which is not too bad. and a maximum frame rate of 74.7 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 24.4 frames per second. Once again, like we said, the GPU really does look like the bottleneck here, but nothing that really stopped us from having fun in this game, GTA 5. The AMD RX550 though did not give us a high frame rates, it really did give us stable frame rates that made this game quite playable. And still only getting an average frame rate of 51.3 frames per second, that is still quite respectable and very much playable. Since last week PUBG went free to play, we've thrown it in our tests once again. We ran PUBG at 1920 by 1080 on low settings. PUBG gave us a fairly playable experience, feeling similar to what we'd say was in GTA 5. With most of our lag starters at the start of the round when we had left the plane, the rest of the game actually ran pretty well. The game itself did seem to get to 60 frames per second, but for most part of it, it was around the mid-50s in the frames. In battles, we did not experience any major frame drops, but during our gameplay, we did not get into any large major battles. Not for this round anyway. Frame rates for PUBG are 51.7 frames per second for our average frame rates. Our minimum frame rates hits 33.9 frames per second, and our maximum frame rates hits 80.7 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 15.3 frames per second. Once again, as we can see, the bottleneck here appears to be the AMD RX550 GPU. The Xeon W3565 seems to be doing quite well, good enough to keep up with the job with the number crunching for this game. The RX550 does seem to be unable to make that magic 60 frames per second that we're hoping to see. However, the 51 frames per second that we did see was still quite good and respectable, and gave us pretty much relatively smooth gameplay that did not affect us in any way whatsoever. We easily can say that the RX550 on this system can play PUBG just fine. However, beware that this could become a degraded thing in larger battles, or if any new updates increase the minimum performance entry point for this game. Our final game today we're looking at is Minecraft Windows 10 Edition. We ran this game on high settings at 1920 by 1080 with a render distance of 32 chunks. Now, since the last update of this game, the major update, the Cliffs and Caves update, let's say update one more time, eh? This game is definitely taking a hit on the performance, and most of you guys who play Minecraft a bit have most likely experienced just this. With our current system configuration and our graphics setup on this game, Minecraft was very playable on this system, but it's worth noting that our frame rate was not all that high. We still managed to stay above 30 frames per second, for the most part of it anyway. Ideally, I'd like to see somewhere closer to 60 frames per second. For Minecraft, our frame rates were, our average frame rate was 38.8 frames per second, minimum frame rates hit 28.3 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate hit 60.3 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows hit 15.8 frames per second. Once again, the bottleneck for our system appears to be the AMD RX 550, though it still did deliver enough for decent gameplay in Minecraft Bedrock Edition, and the lower frame rates did not affect our gameplay as much as competitive online games would, such as PUBG and Fortnite and so forth. So on that note, we give it a pass. We could ramp the graphics back in Minecraft to net us better GPU performance, but to be honest, I felt that the game played quite well with this setup. The CPU did keep up with this title really quite well, without any major problems that we'd notice. So at the end of the day, we could actually recommend Minecraft on this system with the current iteration of where it's at. Though it's worth noting that an update may be just around the corner that makes this GPU just not able to play at these settings just as well as it is today. However, I think we are safe for now.
Now, wrapping this system up, the X58 platform is still not a bad platform these days to play games in my opinion. That is if you plan to stay away from some of those newer AAA titles that are being released. Some of the platform's strengths on this system are CPUs can be found on eBay, so upgrades can be done on the cheap. Some of which are 6 cores, 12 threaded CPUs. Having more RAM slots from this platform over standard desktop platforms can make upgrading the RAM quite cheap as well, since you can buy the more unwanted 2GB module DDR3 RAM and get up to 12GB with just 6 sticks, which can't be done on a standard desktop platform. Now, it's worth saying that these Dell workstations can be found on secondhand markets for cheap, and as we said before, they can be easily upgraded quite cheap and quite effectively. You still won't have all the new instructions from newer CPUs, which will be needed to run more modern games. As time gets by, this will also become more evident and a bigger problem. Though patches and mods can be found to bypass some of these problems, just be warned that over time, this is just going to become more of a problem. So you do wonder, is it worth upgrading to something a bit better and stretching that budget? That will have to be left up to you to decide. The AMD RX550 is very much a gaming GPU, though it's a budget gaming GPU. This GPU will get you going with most games for 1080p gaming, but don't expect anything special. In regards to this, I feel something with a bit more grunt would make this system much better. Something more like a GTX 1050 or an RX 560 would make a better combination overall. But we can't deny the price we pay for everything, and on that note, this is a great low budget setup. In regards to the system, I feel something with a bit more grunt in the GPU department, like a GTX 1050 or an RX 560, would be a lot better combination for this system. But we can't deny the price we pay for everything. And on that note, this is a great low budget setup, in my opinion anyway. Thank you once again for watching us here at the OFFbit. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. If you want to keep updated on what's happening and what's coming up, check us out on our Patreon page. Well, that's us for another video. We'll catch you guys next time on the OFFbit.